Hi, this is Austin Wintory, and this is the Game Maker's Notebook. Today, I have the real fun of speaking with a good friend and very talented musician and composer named Marcin Przybyłowicz, who's the in-house composer and music director for CD Projekt Red for the last 10 years or so, contributing to The Witcher 2 and 3 and all the other games under that banner. And then, of course, for the last several years, Cyberpunk 2077. It was a fairly long conversation, so we managed a pretty substantive and deep dive into his work and just the general task of tackling projects of that scope. It was an absolute joy. I hope you enjoy listening. Minor spoilers, nothing too crazy, but there are, I think, some things that might constitute minor spoilers. You are forewarned. And now, enjoy.
Welcome to the Game Maker's Notebook, a podcast featuring a series of in-depth one-on-one conversations between game makers providing a thoughtful, intimate perspective on the business and craft of interactive entertainment. The Game Maker's Notebook is presented by the Academy of Interactive Arts and Sciences, a member-driven organization dedicated to the recognition and advancement of interactive entertainment.
Here we go. Another long distance transatlantic for I think only the second time, if I'm remembering correctly, podcast. This is going to be the second time I'm doing this now. I did it first with Gustavo Santaolalla a little while ago, where before we say anything, in your case, I need it far more desperately. And I know you've tried this with me before when we had the great pleasure of hanging out in Poland. For the life of me, I don't think I will ever be capable of saying your last name, but I'm going to have to record an intro to the show. So with full humility, please coach me in the proper Polish pronunciation because I'm a useless American who only speaks English.
I really appreciate all of you trying to do that, but, it's... on the other hand, I realize that us talking native tongue sounds for you like or talking backwards. So if you really want to try, it's your funeral, man. I
want to give it a shot out of respect. I owe it that much.
Okay. So it's my name is Marcin Przybyłowicz.
Yeah. All right. We're going to walk through this step by step. Because what's so funny is, one more time for me and slowly and deliberately, because I think reading it on the screen while you say it actually makes it more difficult because the transliteration of the like English, the alphabet letter, they don't translate in the transliterated way directly. Like there's so many syllables that sound very different than how they would in English. So it's actually difficult if I read. So anyway, say it again so I can, and I will not look at the screen.
Okay. Przybyłowicz.
God damn it. One more time. I swear I'm not an idiot.
Yeah, I know. Okay. Przybyłowicz.
Przybyłowicz.
Yeah, with hard P at the beginning.
Przybyłowicz.
That's actually very close.
Marcin Przybyłowicz. All right. Before we end, I'll make sure that you help me one more time, so I have a hope of getting the intro correct.
Okay.
But I am delighted and honored to be chatting with you, and because obviously we're on the eve of the release of. In a year that has had some pretty seriously hyped titles, it's probably fair to say this is the most hyped. Even it's obviously very neck and neck competition with The Last of Us Part 2 in this category, but they don't get much more hyped than this. We'll say that in the form of Cyberpunk. But just first off, how are you doing? How is life in Poland? Obviously, it's kind of a cliche to sort of talk about the pandemic and all of that because it's just so omnipresent. But we also can't really avoid it, and I certainly don't want to presume that your life is fine and happy and normal. So, just how are you, and how are you weathering all of this?
Yeah, define normal first of all, right? Given the time. So Quick answer would be the life is as shitty as everywhere else at the moment. We're having big spikes of new cases every single day, so we are facing second lockdown at the moment. So that obviously means a lot of serious repercussions. But on the other hand, I know it's a not politically correct thing to say, but I'm kind of enjoying it. I
You're not the
can.
first composer to say that, so don't worry.
I've been working from home since March. I visited CD Projekt headquarters only a few times in past 8 months already. Yeah, 8 months.
Wow.
And it turns out we can deliver AAA title working remotely. 800 people working remotely, not only in Poland
Yeah,
but
it's up
also.
to 800.
Yeah, it's a big crowd already. Yeah, and we're still growing, so it's mind blowing. So my kids still go to kindergarten and school, so that part of life is still kind of normal, but we're trying to estimate how long is it gonna take to actually close everything once again. We'll see about that, but other than that, we're doing great actually.
Well, let's just get straight into it. Actually,
Mhm.
the game was originally slated for release earlier, and so I'm assuming that the score was mostly in pretty good shape at the beginning of the pandemic. But you tell me. I mean, where um, has was the music workload at relative to when you had to shift to working from home?
Well, initially we were gonna launch the game, if I'm not mistaken, on April. Yeah, that was
That
gonna
sounds
be
right.
April this year. So that means when pandemic hit us in March, we were kind of done. But truth is, you're never done when working on projects of that scale. There's always, a new gap to fill in. There's always something to reiterate or polish, or cinematic length can change. Some new elements in quests can be added, and that obviously means we have to answer to those challenges with music. So actually, even though I can freely say we are done with the music. It doesn't mean we have stopped working on it, because there are still patches coming up. So that means we can still tweak some details with mixing, for example. So I think you stop working on a game once people start to actually play it. Yeah.
Even then, I feel like it can easily just go forever until basically something takes its place. Until
Hmm.
whatever comes, Cyberpunk 2 or Witcher 4 or something like completely supplants it or something else entirely. Well, so let's actually zoom out, since I kind of maybe got a little bit ahead of myself. For those um, who are hearing your voice, and that it's hard to imagine people who would be unfamiliar with your work, but maybe not as familiar with you personally.
Hmm.
Your actual title, first off, you're not a freelance composer in the way that I am. You actually work for CD Projekt Red, and your title, beyond writing the music, you are, if I correct me if I'm wrong, the music director.
Yeah, that's
Um,
correct. Hmm.
and now let's distinguish that for our illustrious listeners from an audio director, because that's actually not so common of a title. I think it speaks to the scope of the music of the games that you work on, that it would require a music director that's actually a separate role from an audio director. So you want to just unpack that a little bit to kind of explain the difference and what that entails in terms of your workload beyond just writing music?
Yeah, sure. So basically, whatever music happens with the things we are doing, it could be a next project we are working on. It may be a another and another Gwent update, for example, which we are still our other project, which we are still supporting, or a game trailer, some other promotional material, that all goes through me. The
Really?
main.
Let me just pause you really quick, because that's actually that's also unusual. So often trailers are marketing agencies and things that basically a senior level creative director might sign off on. But I, as a composer, for example, almost never have anything to do with the trailers of the games that I work on. Sounds like that's not the case at all then in your case.
Yeah, that's correct, and I think it comes. It's set up in a way because, as funny as it sounds, CDPR considers themselves as an independent company. Well, financially, obviously, that makes sense because we are self-funding our games. So that means, we do not have any publisher deal that's over our heads and that makes us do certain things in a specific way, for example. Or, the other upside of that is that when we need to delay the game, we are just doing that. So, pretty luxurious place to be in, actually, when it comes to developing stuff. So because of the company being basically, self-made at every single front, that means when it comes to promoting our work, so releasing, game footage, trailers, cinematics, whatever, we really believe that the message we are sending to the world needs to be cohesive. It needs to be, it's like writing a story. Every good story has a hook. Then you expand on this hook, then you have a resolution, a grand finale, and then you end. And basically that's what we are trying to do with whatever goes online, whatever goes public. So people, once they see the trailer, have a pretty good idea. Also, when it comes to the music and all these things that music touches upon, like emotional layer, for example, what the game would be actually in reality. I don't know if I made myself clear.
No, that's perfectly clear. And that's also very luxurious, because I often find that the music, especially when they'll use like a pop song or something, so often the music is selling a game which in my mind is not the same as the game we made, because they're like, it's just going to be a cool trailer and people are going to want to, they'll respond because it's a cool trailer. The extreme of that is when they'll do like a live action shoot for a game that's not live action. Anyway, I don't want to go down that rabbit hole too far, but it's just, I love that you get to actually kind of shepherd that process and represent the games, in a way that's everyone internally is agreeing this is what Cyberpunk is, or this is what The Witcher 3 is.
Well, at least I'm trying to, right?
Well, so far so good, I think. So then, does that mean do you have an audio director internally that you are collaborating with or answering to, that's kind of overseeing, and are you also as a related question then, are you involved in the motion capture or voice, vocal, voiceover recordings, all that kind of stuff outside the domain of music? Like, is that adjacent to you, or are you directly involved in any of that as well?
I can say I have a really sweet spot when it comes to my work, because I'm only dealing with music. No voice acting, no voiceovers whatsoever. We have separate team dealing with just that subject. And when it comes to working with audio department, it's actually a bit funny thing, because we are trying to hire audio director for like 5 years already, and we haven't found, our guy yet. So in theory, I would be working with that person if he or she would be, present at the company. But reality is, when I joined the company of almost 10 years ago, we were finishing Witcher 2, and I started actually as a sound designer back then. And there was 3 of us. Then the team started to grow. I switched to music because that's, well, I've been trained my whole life in music, so sound design part of the job was always like an additional thing for me, like a side gig. So because we started small, we quickly learned how to, work like a basically military commando. So, we act fast, we talk fast to each other, we discuss things, straight to the point. And even though we do feel and experience lack of having audio director, and having one would make our lives so much easier, we've kind of adapted to the situation and found our way through the whole process of production, developing a game to deliver the game that sounds cohesive, without having actual audio director on board.
Yeah,
even though having one would be much better.
Yeah, I mean, the sheer number of audio assets that must be in a game. I mean, like when I worked on Assassin's Creed Syndicate, I remember the audio director Lydia telling me, I wish I could remember the exact number. I might be off by a fair number, but there was like 40 or 50,000 lines of dialogue in the game.
Yeah, it's
maybe
ridiculous.
more.
Yeah.
And it's like just tracking the dialogue and then knowing that there's going to be tens of thousands of sound effect files and all the Ys or Fmod or whatever sessions that are stitching everything together. And then I think you told me that there was over 7 hours of score.
It's actually close to 8 hours now.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So it's like, just if only in a literal file management standpoint, the fact that everybody's operating with some degree of independence and it still manages to ship is very mind-blowing. That's very impressive.
It was a hard lesson to learn, but you need to adapt, right? You work with what you get, as they say. So that was actually the only way for us to actually go through.
Well, yeah. Well, let's go back in time a little bit to those earlier days. You started when the company was still had not yet shipped Witcher 2. You said about 10 years ago or so.
Yeah, correct.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so just as a little bit of background, then you came in as sound design, but you were lifelong musician, composer. Something I don't remember asking you, maybe I did, when we first met, was I knew that you had this similar kind of very musical composer background as
Mm-hmm.
I did. But when did you actually choose, like, say, I this is what I would want as a career, even despite the fact that you got in as sound design? We'll get to that in a second. But what age were you when that kind of that light bulb turned on about, music is the life from now on?
Well, music has been life for me since I was, I don't know, 3 or 4. My parents set up my musical education, pretty quickly. Also because I've come from musical family. My father is quite well-known jazz drummer in Europe. So even though obviously he's about to retire now, but in his prime, he traveled, the whole world, performed with my later on jazz heroes, and actually this is the background I was given, jazz. So primarily, on paper, I'm not even a musician per se, but a conductor, because I finished jazz conducting. But that's college, so I'm doing a big leap here. So the point is,
principally big band, I assume, and like jazz orchestra.
Exactly, yeah. Predominantly big bands.
Are you the Polish Henry Mancini, and I've never known it?
I wish I could have been, but there's not really a market for big band conductors nowadays. So it's nice to have this craft.
Conductors in general are an endangered species.
It doesn't really do anything for me.
Even though somebody told me that, but I just couldn't remember. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. Even though it's a beautiful piece of art, but still, no one really listens to jazz big bands anymore. Anyway, so I've been trained to play piano for I think 15 years, and I hated it. So somewhere around entering high school, I figured that when I change instrument, I'm gonna make my life easier, and I won't have to be forced to practice on the instrument that often. So my parents asked me, okay, which instrument do you want to play? And I said trumpet, like Louis Armstrong, like Miles Davis. It's gonna be so fun. And little did I know that, playing brass instruments actually requires fucking discipline, man. So
Yeah, no kidding. It's not a
yes,
joke when they say your mouth can bleed.
yeah, that's true. So I set a quite a heavy trap on myself. So I've spent whole high school and most part of my musical college playing on trumpet. But the point is, I have never been a good instrumentalist. I was never great at piano. I was certainly never great at trumpet. So, I was about to enter my, let's say, professional part of life with being pretty average musician. So I had to reinvent myself pretty badly. And so it turns out when we were forming bands, in high school, in college, I was always the one to take care of the stuff we're gonna play. So I was, the band's arranger, so to speak, right? And that actually was going pretty well for me. So I figured that maybe I should start doing it professionally. And actually, I started with arranging stuff for people. And then I quickly realized that even better part of creative job is to actually write your own music rather than adapting someone else's stuff to play on a specific set of instruments. So I figured that since I love movies, I would be a film composer. Obvious, right? Easy.
Yeah,
uh,
right.
yeah, and I was like, I think I was 21 or 22. I tried to break into the film industry in Poland, and it turned out it's not that easy actually, and it's fucking hard.
What
So,
do you think is the film like? How extensive is the Polish film industry, or how much then? I mean, is there a lot of production going on?
well, obviously it's not that big as Hollywood, obviously, but given the size of our country, it's fairly big to a point where we have quite a few film festivals that are renowned on European, let's say, festival market. So it's quite big and actually quite, in terms of art, we are producing lots of art films as well. So it is definitely a place to be. Also, when you count in all this TV stuff that is happening here. So yeah, once that failed, I quite by accident discovered that there is a gaming scene in Poland, or to be precise, industry that and that games are actually made in Poland. I know Painkiller was a Polish game, but I really never paid attention actually of what is developed in Poland or what was developed in early 2000s. So
Were
I
you a
started to.
gamer? Were you a gamer during that?
Oh yes, yes. I have been avid gamer actually since I was. That's actually a good story, how my gaming life started. So
All right, hit me.
so the setup is, it's my father's turn to take care of me because my mom was working. I was, I think, 7 or something like that. And my father gets a call from his friends who runs a music store in our city. And he goes like, you need to come immediately. I've got a new batch of drums. You need to check it out. But I've got my kid this evening. Bring your kid, whatever. We're going to find some entertainment for him. You need to check those drums. So he grabs me, we drive to the store. And turns out there is this old IBM machine at the back of the store on social area, and supposedly they have some games installed. So my father's friends goes like, yeah, we're gonna sit him in front of the computer, we're gonna launch some game, the kid's gonna be busy, and we're gonna have a good time with the instruments. And they left me there for like 3 hours, and there was just one game installed on that machine, and that was the first Doom. So
Perfect.
that was my exposition to video games. I was, it sounds ridiculous in 2020, especially, but imagine yourself placing a 7-year-old who never played video games before in front of the Doom for 3 fucking hours. So, that was my eye-opening moment, and I fell in love with video games ever since. My second gaming experience was Hexen, so, the path had been paved for me. And I've been playing video games since then, actually.
It's so funny. It's not at all the same story, but in a way, it's connected. Is one of my early. I mean, my dad and my sister had played NES when I was a kid, and so I have memories of like kind of rotating in on the NES with them back in those days. But then I distinctly remember a store, like a big department store, opened up near our house when I was maybe, I can't remember how old I was, but this was in the early 90s, maybe 1994. So kind of mid. Anyway, I remember we went to this store and there was a PC demo, like like Pentium 286 or something, the future, and there was they had installed and was running the LucasArts game Full Throttle.
Nice one.
And the demo was like 5 minutes long. It was the opening few minutes of the game, and I had never heard of it. Although I had played, I think, Monkey Island by that point, but I don't know how. Maybe I hadn't. Maybe I need to evaluate my own personal history. I just remember my parents were like, trying to find, they were there for something specific, it was like they have to buy a towel rack or something. All I know is that I glued myself to that computer and I was blown away by that game, and I just couldn't walk away from it, and was like, I remember begging and saying, can we get this game? I have to know what happens after this demo, because I replayed the demo like 5 times. And I think of that and LucasArts in general as kind of why I became passionate about games, because of that similar thing of just like inadvertently stumbling into something that you had no expectation of, it kind of reshaping your life very quickly.
Absolutely.
Doom is certainly, I think there's a lot of folks, it's kind of like they say, what score got you into soundtracks? And it's always like, for a certain age, it's Star Wars. For
Star Wars, obviously, yeah.
Or Danny Elfman's Batman is another one of those that comes up a lot. Is like that's the one that made me realize scores are a thing. And in any case, so that's amazing. So you, in the background of your whole life, then you were an avid gamer since that fateful day of playing Doom at the music store. So you said that you discovered around this time your frustrations with the Polish film industry led you to look around at the Polish game industry. And at this point, you were like, I guess, early 20s, you said, right out of school-ish?
I was actually in the middle of, I think that was the second year of my college, something like that. So, it was, I was, let's say, grown up enough to start thinking about what I would do in my future professionally. How would I earn money? What kind of person I would do out of myself. So I discovered that actually video games are made in Poland, and actually they're not that bad. So maybe I should give it a shot. Obviously, I didn't know jack shit about anything regarding composition, music production, making music on a computer, not even mentioning how to make a video game. Because I, was never interested in making games. I was always interested in playing ones.
Right.
So I think this part of the story is quite similar, at least to stories of my friends, where I found a group of people who were trying to do mods for games. And I found a group who were doing mode for Fallout 2, and obviously they were planning to then switch to making their own games. And obviously that would be MMORPG, because every single amateur team wants to do MMORPG as their first project, right? Think big.
So
Uh,
I've totally been there. I know exactly.
yeah. Starting from that point, I gradually started to unpack this whole game dev thing, how games are made, how much effort actually it takes to make a game, even a simple one. I worked as a freelancer for 5 years. Then I finished college. I actually got kicked out from college because I was committing so much to this video games thing. So I had a year-long gap in my education, so I could focus like primarily on my newfound passion. Um, then I got back to college, finished it, moved to Warsaw.
Okay, that was going to be my question. Is where was
Yeah.
this? Out of curiosity, where was the school?
You really want to know the city's name? Brace yourself.
Well, I'm someone who has had the joy of visiting a few different cities now. In Poland. I'm starting to know the landscape a little bit better.
Yeah, I know you've been to Kraków, to Wrocław, to Warsaw, but you haven't been to Bydgoszcz.
You are correct, sir.
So I moved to Warsaw as a freelancer, which actually wasn't going really good. And then my friend, who was already working at CDPR, overheard on the corridor that they need a hired gun, an extra pair of hands to wrap up Witcher 2. Because they were deep in the woods. There was only 4 or 5 months before release. The project looked pretty bad. It looked in pretty bad shape in terms of audio. So they got me in only for a contract job. So, just a few months and then you go out. But once I finally entered the promised land, because what I should also mention that what cemented my urge to do big projects, because even though I'm freelancing all the time, apart from working for CDPR, I found that the most joy I find is in those big projects. So even though they are exhausting and super hard to do, this is probably what drives me. It's 2007, The Witcher 1 gets released, and this is a prime time story for every news program in Polish TV. Polish video game based on the Witcher books is made. Its budget is like 20 million zlotys, which is like super high at that moment in time. And this is the most important story of the night on every single TV channel. And I'm watching that news program and say to my then girlfriend, now wife, that this is the aim. This is what I should be aiming for, and someday I'm gonna work for them. And then 4 years later, I actually stepped into the doors of CDPR's headquarters. Even though it was a contract job, I knew that I cannot let it go. So I need to prove myself at every single moment, at every single field, to prove my worthiness, and convince them that it would be very unwise for them to let me go. So, so even though my tasks were I remember my first task was to do sounds for 2,500 work animations. Like you have a peasant in a village, and one peasant is nailing a wooden plank. Someone is sweeping, someone is cooking, that sort of thing.
Right.
So yeah. I was doing that, but later on I discovered that even though the music is technically implemented in F mode, it really doesn't take full advantage of the system. That we could do so much more with how music is handled, how it adaptively reacts to whatever is happening on screen, how it can be tied to narrative arcs. So I started to tinker around that and actually made few prototypes that would then a year later allow me to switch positions from sound designer to composer, and then gradually to music director. And basically
Well, sorry, go ahead. I cut you off right at the finale. But I have questions.
That's actually the finale. That's my story.
All right. Well, amazing. I love all of that. But there's two things that raises. First off, uh, for all this discussion of music and being the Polish Henry Mancini and this well acclaimed jazz drummer father, and where did you pick up sound design as a skill to be able to go in there and actually do that? Because you just certainly didn't mention anything that made it obvious where you picked that up as someone who's so music focused,
Hmm.
musically trained and literate. Where did you even learn? Did you just had you done much? That's a better way to phrase it. Had you done much sound design prior to that, or were you kind of flying by the seat of your pants?
Well, I did discover that I need to learn how to sound design when I started to be very hungry and people weren't hiring me. Because for some reason, most of indie devs back in the day thought that it's easier and cheaper to have one guy who would cover both music and sounds rather than having two guys doing separate jobs. So it
Right.
was actually mandatory for me to prove myself on the market and, get gigs, basically.
Yeah, I see. So purely a practical. So it wasn't necessarily born of a passion for sound design as just literally a way to put food on the table.
Yeah, that was pure calculation, because, yeah, but, even though years after that, it actually still pays off because I was fortunate enough to do sound design for The Vanishing of Ethan Carter, indie game by the Astronauts, launched, I think, in 2018 or so, 2017, maybe, well, some
Yeah, I
time
thought
ago.
earlier. Yeah, right.
And it turned out to be a very successful title. Even my sound work has been how do you say that? Has been God damn it! I need to fire translator. Wait. Uh, Obviously noticed. Yeah, that was I was missing for. Yeah.
Got
So
it.
yeah, to a point that where my sound work was actually noticed not only in the reviews but also I got few awards for this. So it's always nice to have a second background, just for fun. So very occasionally I still do or support smaller teams with sound design, but I'm lucky enough to do it now on my terms. So
Right.
only when I really want to.
And I guess so. Then related to that, the other thing I was going to ask, but I think you've kind of answered it, was how you picked up Fmod as well, because certainly playing in bands and things like that doesn't really call for it. So you were, I guess, early on learning those tools also, and just put it into use basically straight out of the gate.
No, not at all, man. Not at all. Actually, it's I think it's called. There's this law of Kruger-Dunning. I think I'm pronouncing it correctly. So it basically means that when you're not really experienced guy in any sort of field, you think of yourself as being an expert, and once you get to more know, you realize how uninformed and uneducated you are, right?
Yep.
So when I got into CD Projekt, I was at the peak of feeling an expert because I was working on video games for like 5 years already. So, I've shipped like 30 titles, even though they were small crap games, but still 30 titles. So, I've got experience. I know how to do shit. And they actually believed me. So apparently I pitched myself very well on a recruitment meeting. So they sit me in front of the computer and they say, okay, this is our engine, this is the audio sound designer. If you have engine related questions, so ask him. This is Fmod, this is your task list, this is our pool of sounds, this is the tools we are using to make sounds. Go. And I had 5 days to do those 2,500 animations and then implement them in Fmod. So I actually had to learn how to comprehend this tool on the fly. And once I got familiar with it and discovered that it has its own musical module that can do stuff with music, that got me interested because I've never loved sound design. I made it because of the need of the moment, and I always wanted to do music. So when I discovered there actually is a tool that allows you to, direct music on the fly, that got me interested. And that's where I actually discovered this whole adaptiveness of music in video games.
So does that mean that the score to The Witcher, the first one, and then I guess up to that point on Witcher 2, they didn't really have an adaptive system in place?
I have no idea how Witcher 1 was created because I had nothing to do with that project. With The Witcher 2, I had enough time during the wrapping up of the second game to introduce some form of interactivity in music. I remember we even tried to do layered approach with some combat tracks, but it was just, making baby steps. I think the how did we call it? Enhanced edition. So basically the Xbox 360 port, because primarily Witcher 2 was released only on PC. So when we did a Xbox port a year later on, we reworked half of the game music-wise.
Wow.
So we actually developed our own systems and, replugged all the music to make it fit better narrative arc. And that was our real starting point at CDPR, to understand that you can do so much with music. Yeah.
Yeah, that's amazing. It's especially amazing because, in my experience at least, if a score is not written to be adaptive, it's very hard to make it afterward. Because if it's basically just a bunch of tracks and stereo mixes and stuff, there's not a hell of a lot that you can do with it. So it's actually very impressive that you were able to kind of dig it apart and rebuild it to be, more adaptive and more reactive.
Obviously to some degree, because it wouldn't be fair to say that, we did equally good job as, let's say, first Assassin's Creed had. It also launched, I think, somewhere around 2011. So, our work was still elementary school level, right, or grade. So we are still, trying out new tools. Well, I like to think that we were tourists back then. Now we are natives.
I love it. So then, in terms of clearly, getting your hands on that system and all that led to the folks there realizing that they would be stupid to let you go, as you say. Did that mean that you were able to go basically straight from the term limits of that contract job into just working straight for them, or was there a gap between those where you had to go off and do something else and then come back?
No, I've managed to avoid this gap, but that meant I was on a test period for over a year. So, it was quite harsh for me, because once you get hired and have this standard 3 months test period, you basically know that, okay, this is the time where you need to prove yourself, get acquainted with tools, procedures, workflows, people, and or other things. And for me, this period was much, much longer. Also, because of the production roadmap we had back in the day. I remember we were planning to release Xbox port of Witcher 2 in 4 months, which took us, almost 12 actually to do it. So that's why my test decision whether to hire me or not on permanent position was postponed, because I was promised that once we release the game, the Xbox title, we're gonna talk about it. And that release date was pushed back and pushed back and pushed back. So it took its time, but once we finally closed the Witcher 2 door and started to think about Witcher 3, how would we switch from corridor-based levels to open world? How would we approach, how we told the story, for example, through quests, dialogues, and other stuff, what we would do with music. That was my moment to, repitch myself, present ideas, how we could do that with the technology we already have, or maybe the new one we would license. And it worked.
That's amazing. Um, shifting into that permanent role, remind me how big was CDPR at that point? Because much smaller than today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was 70 people strong studio when we did Witcher 2.
70. Yeah.
70. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny because 70 is still not a small studio.
Well, compared to 800,
Yeah, well, exactly. That's the thing. 70 people is, like I do a podcast with Mike Bithell, who's, made a bunch of indie games in the UK. And I think the largest team that they've ever had on one of his games was 20. And so it's like 70 to him would feel gigantic.
Yeah.
And then to think of being more than 10 times that today. I mean, what is that growth? How has that felt just to see over the last 10 years or so that, literal over 1,000% scope? Like what is your perspective on that? I mean, it's hard for me to, especially as someone who's never been a staff anything, it's really hard for me to even comprehend that.
Well, I do remember a very, how would you call it, private, cameral atmosphere. Not a lot of people, every single face by name, but by their interests, who is married, who is not married, who is divorced, and so on. And it creates this, almost tribal-like level of connection between each other.
Sure.
And like we're one pack, right? When we started to develop Witcher 3, we started to grow significantly because we realized as a company that we need more workforce in order to deliver whatever we have planned for the Witcher 3. And we did finish Witcher 3 with having 3,500 people on board. So that was already a big change. Yeah, a big increase in numbers. But at that moment in 2015, it was, I still felt that spirit of being a one big herd, basically. Now it's much harder to maintain it to a point where you suddenly realize that you probably can find people, your coworkers you have never spoken to, for example. Which is sad at one point, on one hand, but on the other hand, I don't know, maybe this is the inevitable thing of evolution of a studio or a group of people. When you grow that fast, it needs to happen anyways, sooner or later. So,
Well, I mean, the success of CDPR is, I would never call inevitable, but I know what you mean. I mean, it is the trade-offs, I think, are pretty easy to understand, and that like you can make something with 800 people that you can't make with even 350, and I'm sure Cyberpunk is going to be a strong testament to that. It's worth noting that by the time anyone is listening to us right now, the game will have been released, but I have not yet played it, and so I'm speaking about it very abstractly. And in fact, I have to say, I'm actually terrified of playing it because I have a tendency to really get addicted and obsessed with games that I really fall in love with, and the scope of it is so gigantic that I feel like I basically have to put my career and life and everything on hold for like 6 months if I want to actually. Because I mean, isn't average playtime on Witcher 3 like 75 hours or 100 hours or something? I mean,
100. Yeah, 100.
It's yeah.
Actually,
So,
I remember you told me the same thing about being scared to play about The Witcher a few years ago in Krakow.
and I still have never, I fully confess, I have such admiration for that game, and I've listened to the music a ton, and obviously we've done concerts together,
Yeah.
and like I really admire it. And I'm also like, it's that admiration, the fact that I love it. I feel like I love it without having even played it, which makes me terrified to play it because I don't know when I'm ever going to have that much time. I barely came. I made the cautious choice to play Insomniac's Spider-Man, which is probably a third as long, but it was still probably 35 hours or something like that. And I there was like a week there where I found myself justifying like I only need to work 4 hours today, and I never do that.
Well, that's actually a huge drawback of working on a big project because you've mentioned Spider-Man. I haven't played it yet. I just now started to play 2018 God of War. I've made through, I think, first 4 or 5 hours. I'm so amazed how this game is delivered to every single tiniest detail. But it still took me 2 years after launch to actually, have some fraction of the time to try it out. So yeah, I absolutely understand what you mean. Yeah.
Yeah, I may end up making an exception in this case just because it just looks that good. I also you guys you've been doing these funny things of casting friends of mine in these cameo roles, and so now I have this kind of friendly obligation to play it as well. When Brian Deckhart told me he plays a vending machine, I was like,
yeah, that was funny. Yeah.
I have to play it now. That was the tipping point. Yeah, that's well. So okay, so let's talk a bit about Cyberpunk. I also do want to talk. I mean, you've worked on, for all the massiveness and hype of Witcher 3, and obviously the things like Wild Hunt and Gwent. There's other games, and you pointed me to one that I had actually missed, called 7, which is full of interesting stuff. I really want to get into that, but before we do,
yeah.
Something that is just, since we're already into Cyberpunk, and it's just obviously everyone's going to be talking about it, and it's just so exciting. One of the things that when we did the show together in Krakow, I think that was when I first learned that Paul Leonard-Morgan was going to be involved, or had already been, probably already for a while at that point, I would guess. How did that connection? Because I don't know if he has any prior history in games, but he's a super talented composer. And I remember being like, oh, wow, that's cool. But I don't remember how that connection was made. So I assume as a music
he actually does have some experience with games. Mm-hmm.
Well, okay, remind me then, because I don't.
Well, he did, prior to Cyberpunk, he did Battlefield Hardline, which for me was okay-ish. It was nice, but in terms of games, what really made him shine, I think, was Dawn of War. That score was stellar. I really like it.
It's funny because Warhammer, kind of as an IP, is one that I'm largely ignorant to. So I never played that, and I'm not familiar with his score on that.
Really? I always wanted to do a Warhammer game. This is like my one of the bucket list things.
Oh, really?
Do a Warhammer game, yeah.
That's funny. Well, we'll have to. I think your resume is starting to approach something that is tolerable. So I think
maybe if I'm lucky, right, in 10 years. Yeah.
Long enough. Yeah, exactly. Well, I have faith in you. They call me for all the composer opportunities there to make sure that I can endorse the hiring. So when they ask about you, I can say, okay, well, look, I think he's worth you.
He may not be the best, but he likes the IP, so at least that, right?
Yeah, exactly. You're gonna get a second-rate score written with massive amounts of passion and dedication. So that's something.
Yeah.
That's funny. It's good to know. Funny enough, I did recently play. I did get into Vermintide 2 a lot recently.
Mm-hmm.
Just found it. A friend recommended it to me. We were talking about games of that type of like online sort of quick in and out squad based. And he's like, you should really play Vermintide 2. It's quite addicting. And so actually, it's officially the only thing that remotely falls under the Warhammer banner. But anyway, all off topic. The point is, Paul wrote a score for that. I will go check it out. I like so many people, I think it was probably like Limitless or Dread, where I thought, oh wow, okay, this guy's legit. This is this is a real composer here.
Absolutely, yeah. So, well, the story was that we knew that, well, for the most part, I was the only one working with the music within the company. Now it's luckily changed. We got PT Adamczyk, who is also in-house composer for 3 years, and actually we are in the process of hiring the third one. So I like to think of ourselves as, you know, the ones who create unicorn opportunities, because it never happens so often that, you know, an in-house composer position is open. So at least I'm trying to, you know, change the world on that end, at least, you know, when I can. But going back to Paul, so we knew that we're gonna need someone else to help us with making this music, because there's, you know, we knew that that's gonna be a lot of it. We did almost 6 hours of content for The Witcher 3, and since we learned so much of how not to do video games music and how not to implement it in a static way, and, you know, that will basically create problems in, you know, after 50 or 60 hours of playtime, we realized that we are not that great at creating long-lasting, evolving systems. So our our solution for that is basically a brute force, which means create more assets, more music.
How much music is in Witcher 3 total?
Almost 6 hours.
Okay.
So, you know, it's not a World Guinness record, but still a lot, right?
But I also love the fact that you describe that as a brute force method, and yet there's fully 2 hours more than that in Cyberpunk.
yeah, exactly. Well, at least, you know, that's what we are doing quite well. So, you know, you ain't fixing things if they work, right? Or whatever they call it. Yeah, if it ain't broken, don't fix it. Oh, that's what I was missing. So going back to Paul, so we realized that we're gonna need someone to help us out with creating that amount of music. And since the project was a major shift in terms of style, well, basically everything compared to The Witcher, we started to look out on the market for someone who would actually be able to contribute creatively to Cyberpunk. And I've created a shortlist, so to speak, of people I think would suit us well. Paul was one of them. Then we started to, you know, analyze them with our creative directors, listen through their stuff, and even though when I started to talk with Paul once he got hired about not using his Dread experience actually was the thing that made him, you know, win this gig, basically. So
why is that? Why the kind of aversion to it?
Well, not aversion per se, but, you know, the Dread movie sums up pretty well this dark part of Cyberpunk 2077. There are lots of similarities between those two titles in terms of how the world is structured, how it's built, this whole concept of mega building, you know, everlasting violence on every level of society ladder or other stuff. So, you know, lots of similarities. What I really liked in Dread was this grit in music, which I very much enjoyed. So, you know, once all of us creatives watched the Dread all together in the company, we've realized that even though we are not planning on basically repeating what Dredd did in terms of music. This guy has ability to, throw enough punch into the music, and that's what we are actually looking for.
Yeah, well, it seems like in a way unavoidable or inescapable, just because the aesthetics of it would seem so deeply compatible. Unless you made this conscious choice to just explicitly avoid that, it seems hard to not benefit from it and draw from it. Because I mean, he did a killer job. That's the thing; it's so good. Um, so that's exciting. So how do you? This is something that's always curious to me because I've been involved in projects before as one among several composers, but I've never been in your position of being the kind of music director who's in the times in which I am the quote music director, I'm the only composer. So directing other composers, was that part of this? Like, would you be the one to give feedback to Paul on a cue, for example, to say, here's what I think we should change about this? Or is there someone that you're both getting feedback from that's on some kind of more creative director level?
No, that was me. So, whenever you happen to talk to him and he starts to trash talk me, he's got a good reason for it. So
yeah, I'm texting him now to set up the follow up, therapy to find out all the real horror.
Yeah, well, when we got Paul on board, we basically knew what we would like to do with the music. We had this, let's say, high level concept of how the music should sound. What kind of styles the music should draw from, and how we would envision music to work within a game, and how much it would, evolve from whatever we have learned with The Witcher. So I remember my first conversation with Paul when I talked to him that, first of all, this is not any Cyberpunk title. So throw away Blade Runner, throw away, Akira, Ghost in the Shell, throw away Deus Ex franchise. These are all great pieces of art, but our Cyberpunk is the Cyberpunk because we are doing a game adaptation of pen and paper RPG system, Cyberpunk 2020, which is a very well established, well written and described lore heavy world. And because of that, and because of the tiny fact that one of the key personas in this universe is Johnny Silverhand, who is rock legend. So that also means that there is lots of musical thought put into how this world or how this universe is constructed. So for me, that meant that basically we need to reinvent the wheel, so to speak. So we did it with The Witcher by accident to a degree. I give you that, but it turned out, pretty well for us with all that Slavic influences with the music, and we were trying to find out.
Just real quick, why do you call it an accident? I mean, it always felt like a deliberate choice. It always felt, because the identity always felt very sure of itself in those scores.
Well, it was kind of accidental because it didn't came from conclusion that we need to hire folk musicians because they will be the most true, they would deliver the most true representation of this Slavic, so to speak, feeling in the music. We started from a point where we decided that the major drawback of The Witcher 2 and Witcher 1 music was that it was made on samples primarily. And while we didn't have the big budget for recording sessions or, hiring an orchestra, for example, we didn't do that for The Witcher 3. I've decided that, okay, we cannot afford having a big 60 people ensemble for, a week on a soundstage for recording sessions. We can afford fraction of that. So let's shift the attention from grand tutti performance towards solo performances, and that would be the backbone of the score. So we started to research basically, people who would play on old instruments, and that happened to be folk musicians. So that's what I call an accident. And obviously we did, build on that once we realized what kind of gold we have in our hands. And as they say, the rest is history. It was very well then thought through, well planned, but the initial spark came from the very different place, actually.
That I totally understand. I've had that as well, where you midway into a project, or even if it's early, at some point you have an insight that you then basically have to kind of it's like from that moment forward, you're kind of starting over because you realize this is what it should be. And it can be daunting because sometimes you're like, oh crap, we just we burned a year on stuff that we're not going to use. But at the same time, it's thrilling because you're like, now we found it. We know what we're doing. We actually have a direction that really feels right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
Did that happen on Cyberpunk in terms of, because obviously, you kind of already hinted at this, but just the whole genre of Cyberpunk has some pretty major musical landmarks in it. And you guys are, I wouldn't say that you do this ultra conscientious avoidance of those things, but it really, I should mention, I've had you very graciously shared the soundtrack with me, and I was able to listen to all of it before we chatted here. And there's still, I think there was a couple hours worth of music in what you sent, so there's still the vast majority I haven't heard, but I heard what was culled together for the album. And I'd be curious to kind of hear how you chose what you chose as a separate thing. But before we get there, it doesn't sound like you're saying, okay, the Vangelises of the world and whatnot, we're completely rejecting that, but you really aren't the same as that either. So finding that balance and the whole 90s influence, why don't you just kind of walk me through how you arrived at that? And was that something decided early, or did you have to kind of get your way into it like you described on The Witcher?
Well, actually, it was more on purpose than with The Witcher. So, the beauty part is that The Witcher made tons of money, which gave the studio independence in terms of how the project is financed, and they could afford us having a 9 months long pre-production for the soundtrack. So basically for 9 months, I call this hugging a tree phase. Basically, you search for inspiration. You walk, you go for a walk. You watch Netflix for all day, right? You play video games because you need to research on stuff, right? And because they allowed us not to hurry, we were actually able to try out things. So that was a new experience for me completely, because even though the development of The Witcher 3 took us 3.5 years, it was 3.5 years of a hard work basically to deliver on time. And sure, mind you, The Witcher was postponed I think 2 or 3 times. So that also means something. So with Cyberpunk, we already have been told that you guys have time. Think about it. Do whatever you need to do to come up with ideas, and then let's meet, let's talk about it, let's see what you have. And since Adam Badowski, who is studio head at CTPR, always tried to educate us that we are not about that our main purpose is not only to make a enjoyable video game, but his aim as a studio head is to create a good of culture, basically. He always wanted games to transcend to other forms of art as well. And his grand ambition is to have video games in general perceived equally as music, fine arts, films, whatever. So with that in mind, we knew that simple mimicking of whatever has been done in the past wouldn't go. So even though I love Blade Runner as a film, I have deep respect for Vangelis's music in that film, but still I knew that it wouldn't do the trick to, obtain some old synthesizers, get a soaring saxophone solo, and that would be it, right? So that's why, so that's why I came out with this 90s thing, because I realized that when you go online and search for cyberpunk music, people oftentimes make a connection between cyberpunk and synthwave, outrun, retrowave, all that, 80s
Yeah, I was going to say
based music stuff.
vaporwave. Yeah, totally.
Yeah,
The
exactly.
synth world is it's like
Yeah,
synonymous for people.
exactly. And back in the day, what was it, 2015, 2016, that style of music was on the rise on the YouTube. Everyone was listening to it. So that got me thinking that, okay, this is what people expect us to do, but the problem is that how this music is rooted in the 80s with all that ARP synths, all that specific FM-based sounds, it really plays well with this neon aesthetics, or imagining yourself, you drive a car through the night, and it's it's raining as hell, and the neons are flashing on your windscreen, for example, and it's all moody, brooding. It's cool, but once I read the script for Cyberpunk, I realized this is not what our games is about. Our games is gonna be, violent, fast-paced, full of colors, full of, and that's the other word I'm missing. Wait. Full of stimulus. So this laid back 80s feeling wouldn't do the trick. So I started to search for music that would translate well with this punch we were looking for. And I realized that when I was young, when I was growing up as a teenager, I was listening to Beastie Boys, to The Prodigy, to Nine Inch Nails. The rave was a pretty big thing back in the day in late 90s in Poland. And that music was, predominantly all about the punch, aggression, rejecting, the system. Rage Against the Machine was huge in Poland back in the day. So, and the common denominator of all these bands, even though they play different styles of music, is this punch, this attitude. And I realized, okay, so this is what we need to do. This is this emotion, this kind of feeling we need to somehow find a way to recreate using modern tools in Cyberpunk. So that's why I've proposed that we should base our score on the 90s, on the energy and aesthetics at 90s, and give it basically modernized flair. And it clicked. It clicked very well.
It really comes off too when you listen to the album. Like it's not a subtle influence.
Oh no, it's all over the place. Yeah.
Yeah, it's very the first things that I noticed when listening to it is for sure. I don't think I heard a single like synth arpeggio kind of thing. So you definitely completely avoid that, even though it's very electronic, it's very synthy, but there's a real distinct difference between the kind of purity of the FM 80s stuff and then the 90s, when it, especially because of Nine Inch Nails, I think of it as more like sound designy, for lack of a better way to put it. And
and really lots of sampling. Yeah.
Yeah, it felt because I listened to it. You first sent this to me ages ago, and I listened to it, before I'd read much of. Well, there was still very little publicly known about the game in general, and we hadn't talked about it in any kind of depth yet, and so I didn't really know what to expect, other than that you had already mentioned like there's definitely a 90s thing instead of an 80s thing. But that I remember thinking this is so much more Nine Inch Nails than Vangelis in a way that's, and yet it's still 2020, like it's still very kind of modern and present and lush, and rich. And even in the guitars and things, the guitars and the bass, they don't feel, there's a kind of a dirtiness to a lot of the way like the 90s kind of punk and alternative sound is. And my take was that you guys, it's slightly cleaner than that. It felt, despite how nasty the synth elements can get, there's still a purity in a way and a beauty to, at least to what I'm hearing. Does that feel like I'm describing this music accurately to your ears? Because there's some really actually, for all the kind of intensity of it, there's also some really introspective and beautiful.
It's actually spot on because in the end it's still a CDPR game, so that means it's gonna be very, very rich on the story. And once you didn't play The Witcher, so you didn't experience it firsthand. But what people say on the internet is that when they played The Witcher, they were torn emotionally. So this game leaves a mark in you, right? In terms of what kinds of emotions it triggers at the specific quests. So even though the setting is violent, colorful, and very busy and very, I would say, teenagey. So it has a lot of ADHD element in it, right? But it's still CDPR's game. So that means the story is actually very mature, very dark, and it's full of these, human to human moments. So we had to find a way how to score these as well, because in the end, it's not always about shooting stuff or blowing stuff up. So, it would have to be this natural counterbalance to, have violent, punchy stuff. Cool. That's always fun to do. But on the other hand, let's try to find a way how to actually score this game emotionally when it needs to be.
Well, yeah, it comes off, but also the big kind of action, very punchy and aggressive stuff, even that felt, video games have this reputation for being just like full on, always dialed to 10, no nuance. And I know that you spoke already to CDPR's general goal to not be like that and to actually have depth and actually have range and nuance and all those things. But it was also very noticeable. I was expecting a kind of sonic assault on my ears when I first listened to the album. And it's not lacking in punch, but I wouldn't ever call it an assault or like a wall of sound. It actually felt, I mean, I know that there's still piles of music I haven't heard, but it felt pretty restrained, even in its aggressive, very fast tempo kind of moments. Is that a conscientious thing as well, of saying, let's not sort of try to just be this explosion in your face, but to sculpt something more deliberate, or am I making that up?
Honestly, I have no idea. I've never thought about it this way. So I don't even know how to react to this. You may be right.
Well, fair enough. I'll send you when we finish. Sadly, it will not be the beneficiaries of our listeners here, but I'll send you an example of what I meant. I'll go find a track title and say, here's an example. Because what I noticed also is sometimes multiple composer teams, and there's 3 of you here, are dividing it up where it'll be like, you're the cinematics person, you're the action person, and it didn't seem like that was the case. It really felt like there were flavors of all different emotions attributed to all 3 of you on this
correct.
one. I assume that's accurate. Okay, yeah. So then what that means is that these general mandates that you're, I think, the primary author of, the kind of high level direction that you are then sharing around, everybody's kind of able to find their own little corner of, and yet it's still pretty cohesive. Like I don't know that I would have been able to, if I was listening to it blindly, I don't know that I could tell, that's one of Paul's, that's one of PT's, that's one of Marcin's. It felt like pretty unified. Was that a challenge?
Well, actually, it was. It sounds stupid and like bragging, but it wasn't actually that hard to do, because the way the game is structured helped us very much. So basically, we have like 3 major themes I would say, that are intertwining throughout the main narrative arc. So we knew that, PT, Paul, and I come from different musical environments. I, for one, for example, had the least amount of experience with electronic music, so I needed to, catch up heavily to other guys to stay on par with them. But we knew that it was not about, breaking either me or PT or Paul into others' will, but
Right.
rather, taking out what's best within us and try to build on that. So we decided that Paul would take over the Arasaka part of the storyline. So basically, Arasaka is this major corporation that runs the city, and for some part of the game acts as a main antagonist, even though they are not really the antagonist per se. PT did this whole transcendence thing with Johnny Silverhand being a digital construct in your head. So that was his field of expertise, and I was left with gangs and cyberspace. So all these three zones had some gameplay elements. We could, stretch our legs in and have some fun with some gameplay combat tracks. But also they were really heavy on the story, so it allowed us also to prove ourselves also in that environment as well.
And what did those three kind of sort of ways of separating it? Did those all come out to be approximately equal amounts of work? Because it comes across like it's relatively evenly shared. But sometimes, one person ends up kind of having to, like, just a certain area of the game is just bigger than other areas of the game.
It's hard to tell. Well, not equal, based to be literal, because PT did like almost 4 hours of music out of 8, so that left
Oh, wow.
us, me and Paul, with just 2 hours. Well, just 2 hours
Yeah,
of stuff to
yeah,
do.
you lazy bastard.
Yeah, but that also needed to happen like that, because Paul was contracted to do specific work. So once he did his work, we obviously stayed in touch, and we are still staying in touch. But he was done with the project. I am still having duties of music director, part of my job. So that means I have to run this whole circus and
Yeah.
basically make bearable enough environment for other to make them comfortable enough to deliver good music. So that obviously meant that I had less time than I would like to have to actually compose on my own. So that left PT with doing the most of it. But in the end, when you add also implementation of the stuff, so that was me and PT job to make sure it all works in game and works as intended, and it's basically bug proof.
That was
So
going to be one of my next questions, actually, if you
Mhm.
don't mind my just jumping right in on that, because
Sure,
that
yeah.
the scope of a game like this, it's easy to look at it and go, okay, big giant world and a lot of systems and a lot of music, but the thing that I think is easy to overlook, that makes people like you and I, but in your case, far more than I, sort of suffer, is writing the music is not even close to half the battle, since the implementation process seems so complicated, where the all the different overlapping systems can easily kind of bug each other.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I mean, like I've finished this game, The Pathless, which is nowhere near the size of Cyberpunk, but it's still a respectably sized open world game with, I wrote about 3 hours of score, and there are so many instances where I'll realize, oh, wait a minute, if the player does this, and then they go over here, and then they go over here, and then they go over here, and then they go to this one area, that cue will be triggering in a way that is not the normal way that we think of that cue being triggered. So we really need to make sure that that works. Well, it's like a 3-hour playtest to even see if it will behave correctly, because of this like very weird scenario in which it could be triggered. And then of course, okay, no, it didn't play right. It started and then it immediately faded out because the system got confused. So we go in, we open up Wise, we realize, okay, there's a conflict here, and it seems like that problem is challenging enough on a game like The Pathless. On a game like Cyberpunk, it feels like impossible. I mean, that's so much to kind of juggle and to test. It seems that you would have to have an entire music QA department. I mean, how do you even approach a problem like that?
Yeah, our music QA department is 2 guys, so it's a small one, but still, we have one.
That's amazing, though. So there are people whose sole job is to basically try to break the music, and they actually understand the goal of the music well enough to know that what it's supposed to do.
Yeah, we wouldn't do it without them. We would be so fucked, really. Yeah, so basically the problem with open world games, as you said, is that you may never be sure you tested out all possibilities. So most likely there will be a player or group of players that will come up with a way to play the game to basically break everything, right? So I think it's always about catching the rabbit, and I'm not sure how many of us did actually catch the rabbit and made completely bulletproof system. Maybe it's possible, I don't know. I haven't done one in my career so far, so I'm still trying to catch that rabbit. So that's the first problem, the open world in general. And the second problem is that when you have a game so heavy on the story like The Witcher or Cyberpunk, you quickly realize that there are 2 contradictionary forces that try to overcome the whole thing, and somehow you need to balance them out so they can coexist rather than cannibalizing themselves. So that was the hard part, but I think we actually weaseled ourselves pretty nicely from that problem, because finally we got to work with the world where electricity exists. So that means we have, compared to The Witcher, right? So that means we can have speakers on levels. So that means, we can have speakers in cars, so you can have radios. People can listen to music in clubs or on their boom boxes while walking down the street or whatever. So that creates a completely new playground for you and new pool of possibilities. So for that reason, that's actually interesting, because for the most part of the production, we decided that we are ditching exploration music completely, because we have sound emitters placed on levels, because we have radios, announcers, TV programs, all that stuff. We do not need exploration music. And obviously it turned out we do need exploration music, so we have added it 2 months before release. So there you go. Another, yes.
What was because is that based on like player feedback, or what was what would make you make that change so late?
I will QA.
Side note, I told you the same thing on Assassin's Creed Syndicate. I said I love the idea that the musician. I mean, there's like buskers and street musicians, so it's not the radios. Mm-hmm. There is music in the world that is going to fill in those gaps and make the world come to life more than a score would in that way. And it worked well for that. And it would seem like all these radios, especially for the very kind of busy urban cyberpunk vision of a city, it's already, you walk down the street, you hear music coming from 50 directions, and this would be potential for even more. So what changed your mind, I guess?
Well, our QA started to play the game extensively from start to finish and realized that we are missing something. We are missing this general atmosphere of the city. Yeah, well, I remember when I was playing the Syndicate, I was trying to deconstruct how the system was set up, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you guys were clever enough to have the musicians, so source music, played on a ground level on the streets, and music was the score, exploration score was triggered when you got up on the rooftops, right?
Yeah, you are correct. It was literally we literally had a hook from the engine telling Wise the player's altitude, and
Uh-huh.
it literally could not trigger music below a certain height. And then the way we did it was that the regions of the city each had their own rooftop exploration cues that were also alternate cues entirely based on the day-night cycle. So if it was like I'm at Westminster Abbey and it's during the day, then the next thing it would look to is where are you in terms of the core mission narrative progression. And if
Mhm.
you have surpassed the mission that's relative to that area of the map, then it would add vocals on top, which actually had lyrics that sort of commented on the music, on the mission that you would have completed. So
Mhm.
that if
Mhm.
you were there before having completed it, you'd get the non-vocal version. And even then, I said, I'd love if we could have a kind of roll of the dice where not every time you went on the roof would it play the music. It would be, I can't remember the final number we ended up. It was like more or less 50-50. It would,
Mhm.
I
Mhm.
think it was slightly more than 50%, but the idea was it doesn't actually have to play, especially if you, the other thing was you had to be up for a minimum amount of time as well. So if you
Mhm. Yeah, there
basically
was a
jumped
time
onto a
limit. Yeah.
roof and
Mhm.
jumped back down, it wouldn't have to immediately trigger an outro.
Mhm. Mhm.
Uh,
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. So that was actually a pretty nice to get away with it, right? So how to marry fire and water, basically source and
yeah,
score.
right.
So
That's a fun
uh,
one.
we actually found a different way to get away with from those problems. So my secret is that all of the music in game, excluding the songs, is in one key. So it's all A minor. So that
The
means
whole score of the entire game.
the whole score is in one key. Yeah. So that means whenever we are experiencing, for example, tracks overlapping in a way we haven't planned. So for example, you have this really underscore-ish path-based exploration cues playing around, and suddenly you enter some restricted area, and combat cue is slapping you in the face. Um, Even if we do not plan the system to work itself out intelligently, it would still sound okay and acceptable, because it would still have this common denominator, because of the same key signature. So maybe it's a lazy approach, but it actually worked,
Well,
and it
it's
saved our asses. Yeah.
yeah, I was going to say it's hard to call it lazy when you have this task of figuring out a way to make 8 hours worth of musical systems that are near impossible to predict every possible permutation of. It's a
Hmm.
system that becomes so complicated that you have to kind of, presumably, you have to simplify um, some parameter at your disposal must be simplified in order
Hmm.
to help make it more palatable. Because yeah, violent crossfades between cues that have nothing to do with each other. That's what has defined games for the last 30 years, and it's one of the things that especially even growing up, I always hated. Where I thought if I can ever work in games, that's one of my quests to try to fix is that interactive systems can actually
Yeah, to make it more elegant, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, no, and that kind of solution is certainly going to go a long way. And I'll give it, and to your credit, listening through the soundtrack album, I don't have perfect pitch, so I didn't spot this, but it does
Hmm.
not come across as though every single piece is in the same key. And normally, if something where you feel it, you just feel like this is all sort of stuck in the same place, but it doesn't actually come across that way at all.
Interesting. Hmm.
Perhaps to someone with perfect pitch, they would instantly go, "What the hell is this?" But but not it didn't even with a reasonable, I think, relative bit. There's so much variety of color and atmosphere in the pieces that it distracts from that.
Yeah, I think that's what draws your attention
Yeah.
from the pitch issues. Yeah. Uh-huh.
Well, so another thing I was curious about that's not really related to that, but we kind of glossed by it a minute ago was, did you ever, because for all intents and purposes, I know this is not literally true, but figuratively speaking, money was basically no object on the score. You presumably, if you had pitched, I'm going to need 4,000 tubas, if you had sold them on that, they would have been able to afford it. At least to a limit, maybe 3,000 tubas. But it seems, unless I somehow missed it, there's nothing even approaching orchestra, even in a textural way. It truly
No.
is, like a band of sorts, as it were, and thorough amounts of electronics. Did you ever consider anything orchestral to kind of give it that little, quote, cinematic tilt, or was it just like, nope, we're sticking to this through and through?
It's actually a damn irony, I tell you, because after the success of The Witcher 3, when I mentioned that we weren't able to afford, having full orchestral recordings, so that's why we went with solo performances, I was promised that when The Witcher sales well, we are promising you're gonna have your budget for the orchestra, for the whole fucking project. And, I was super happy. We start to work on Cyberpunk. I know that finally I have, enough money to actually, go wild with ideas. And suddenly I realized that it's actually not fair, because this project cannot have orchestral music, because this is not, what screams Cyberpunk from our perspective. I know Oliver de Rivera did Remember Me, which was a very nice and creative take on Cyberpunk, while keeping this symphonic sound, yet processed, but still symphonic. But still, it was not Mike Pondsmith's Cyberpunk. So I came to them and said that they were actually very, sneaky and clever about it. That they promised me the orchestra, and they told me, yeah, but you're gonna do Cyberpunk, so good luck with that. But instead of that, that meant we had enough room or enough options on our table to basically compose a dream team we would love to work with. So that's why we got Tina Guo on board. That's why we got Ilan Rubin from Nine Inch Nails, drummer, on board. That's why we got Richard Devine, who created bespoke sounds for us, and we started to build from there.
Yeah, that was actually Tina. Is I mean, obviously, I've talked about her, and when we hung out in Poland, she was performing my Journey music that she was the original performer of. So she's someone I have a lot of history with, and I was not at all surprised, given her pedigree as an electric cellist.
Yeah.
But tell me a little bit about, because I one of the things that some people always laugh, like they hear the Wonder Woman theme and they go, "Oh, who played the electric guitar?" And they don't realize that that electric cello and electric guitar are not the same thing. But with certain kinds of music, it can be very difficult to tell them apart. If it's not really written to be a cello part, sort of distorted strings are going to sound pretty similar regardless of what's making them vibrate initially. And so what was your process of sort of turning her loose? Was she improvising and doing her Tina thing, which she does so well? Were you, giving her, very bespoke parts? How did that go? Because she's capable of literally anything and everything one could ever imagine.
That's so true. Yes, that's so true. So first of all, Tina is a natural fit for that project, because of two reasons: because of her attitude and how she plays electric cello, and also because we knew that we need to have some sonic countermeasure to all this electronic stuff. it's still cyberpunk. Yes, it's gonna be dirty, violent, and heavily processed, but we still need this human element in music. And obviously, you can program your synthesizer like crazy, but in the end, it's still a dead box. It can produce sounds. You can, try to fool your audience that this sound evolves and is alive and goes places, but in the end, it's all about programming an oscillator and modulating it in some way, right? So even though it's fine and it's nice, it doesn't have this breath of a soul. So Tina was, as I said, a natural fit because her sound of her electric cello fits so well to our sonic palette. That's the one thing. And second thing is that even though we had lots of themes written for her, we did actually cut her loose several times to improvise.
Okay.
And I think these are the better deliveries of her cello, even better than the themes we wrote. Yeah.
I mean, she has a gift. She's far and away.
Absolutely.
I think she's probably the most talented musician I know. It just explodes, and I love that for how delicate of a cellist she can be. She can summon a hurricane that's just nuts.
And what even strikes me more is that you've mentioned several times with our conversations that you guys have history with Tina, and you guys know each other for a very long time. I haven't worked with her in the past, so that was my first time. And what's have been striking me constantly is that we found our common dialect very quickly, and she so quickly understood what we are trying to do and was able to contribute on top of that to make it even better. Than that was beyond any expectation, really.
Well, first off, that's utterly unsurprising. Even though it is always surprising, it still surprises even me, despite a million projects, that she just clicks with it so fast and so well, and finds
a real pro.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's no wonder that everybody works with her, just never wants to work with anybody else ever again after that. And but with you have also these other very acclaimed performers. Did all of that? I'm not trying to unearth any gossip here at all. Was it equally kind of productive, and was that whole recording process an easy one? Sometimes recording can be very slow and tedious. I know with Tina, she tends to be an exception, but just in general, bringing all this to life, how was that?
I remember we were quite afraid of how session with Ilan Rubin would turn out to be, because the reason behind getting Ilan on board was that we decided we want to have actual drum performances, even though I believe that drums are probably the easiest thing to program with samples from the sound perspective. So if you need to fool someone or convince that this is the actually real human playing, I think with enough time you can program these drum parts to mimic the actual performance very well. But we knew that we want to have the real deal, and we all have been totally in love in John Bonham's technique on drums from Led Zeppelin.
Yeah.
So this big punchy drums, the way he did attack the drums with the stick, and he's dead obviously, so no chance of hiring him. But when we tried to look for someone who would have the similar technique of slapping the drums, Ilan was the first to come to our mind. And the challenge was that we actually went to record a drum library with him, so we didn't have any music composed. yet at that moment.
Ah,
So yeah, that was a new for him as well, because
patterns and fills and things like that.
yeah, we did prepare like a shitloads of sheet music with written grooves, uh, some rudimentary arrangements underneath them, so he can feel more comfortable while playing. But the main aim was basically to obtain a library of sounds that we would later on use in our arrangements. But then again, once we let Ilan loose to improvise, that was again the highlight of the session, and most part of the live drumming in the score is actually Ilan improvising. So we do use obviously these library-based grooves, but the places where Ilan shines actually is when he improvises.
Yeah, that's I find that tends to be very, in my experience at least, that has that is consistently true with drummers specifically. I every time I have ever gotten the most out of a drummer, and it doesn't have to, it could be a normal session musician that's nowhere near the kind of acclaim of someone you're talking about, but just literally someone showing up to do it on the day, and someone who can read
Mm-hmm.
every last little note that you've put in front of them with all the different techniques required to pull off. And yet there's something that needs to be so intuitive about drums that it just never sounds as good as when I say, you know what, you get what I'm after, now just play. And
Yeah, do your thing.
better.
Yeah, exactly.
It's
Mm-hmm.
so frustrating because as a composer, I want to be able to write the right thing. Uh, and yet some things have to just kind of come from the gut, it seems, to be truly authentic. And I have this
But
with these musicians on the Pathless, these these throat singers from Tuva, where I tried writing music, and then at some point I realized that throat singers don't respond to that. It's like Jurassic Park, where he goes, T-Rex doesn't want to be fed; he wants to hunt. You gotta lean into the natural talent and skill for all that it can be.
Yeah, but you know what? On other hand, it all comes to realization that you as a composer do not have to be an expert in every single instrument. How what are the techniques of playing on that instrument as well. I learned that when I recorded with the Percival folk band for The Witcher. The problem there was that they were mostly self-taught musicians, so they weren't that good on musical notation.
Right.
And me coming from academic background, so I even though I did a lot of research on folk music, I did prepare myself in a very academic way. I did prepare sheet music, some arrangements, some preliminary ideas how I would like them to play on these instruments, but quickly I realized that it doesn't click between us. They do not understand my world. I may not be that good with understanding what they are the best at. And it actually did click when we started to improvise the whole sessions. So I remember the first 3-day session was a complete wreck with them. Then we waited half a year and we did set up another week-long session. So, 12 hours in the studio, 7 days straight. And that was the best time of my life, really, because we threw away out of the window all the things we were trying to do in the past and just agreed that, okay, you know how to improvise because you learned yourself how to play these instruments. I come from jazz background, so I know a thing or two about improvisation as well. So let's do jam session. Let's fucking jam and see what happens. And that was, that was where we found this fire, this spark. And it taught me that you as a composer need to cover, a lot of fields when it comes to creating music, but it doesn't mean you have to be an expert on every single one of them, because once you get people on board, it's their job to elevate the whole thing, right? It's their job to, make, well, it may sound harsh, but make music shine. So that also means make your art shine even more. But this is how I see things after that experience, really.
I completely agree. I've my take on that, or my version of that sentiment, is that unless you're talking about fully sequenced electronic music, which is something that I do very rarely, there's usually always some performer of some kind in there, if not almost entirely live performers. And as a result, my version of what you said is that people are never hearing what I wrote. They're hearing what the musician played. And
Yeah.
there's a real big difference between those two. And even if they're playing exactly what I wrote, their interpretation of what I wrote is still what hits the eardrums of the listener. And if they love it, I almost am always convinced it's because the performance was given the room to be expressive and to be emotive. Because a brilliant piece of music played with handcuffs, Yeah,
it needs to be honest. It needs to be honest first and foremost.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's and I did feel that human element in the cyberpunk music, even despite how overwhelmingly electronic it is. I did find myself wondering. We hadn't talked about the drums, and there were a few times where I said, that doesn't sound sequenced. That feels like someone going nuts. But it can be hard to tell with drums, because if you really commit the time to programming them well, you can do stuff that's pretty amazing. And so I wasn't prepared to say I am sure that is just some masterful drummer, but it felt like it. So I'm glad to hear that my nose was not pointing me in the wrong direction.
Absolutely, yeah, you were right.
There's something else I wanted to ask you about, and you've already been very generous with your time, but there's something else that I'm just curious how it interacted with you. Is that you already hinted at how much music there is in the game as actual source music, diegetically in the world. That must have meant also, beyond 8 hours of score, massive piles worth of licensed music, which I'd love to just hear how involved you were in that process. But then also, I've recently read about how there's like a band in the game there's a whole musical story there too. So
yes, there is.
The scope of the music outside of the score is practically just as big as the score, it sounds like.
It is huge. Yes, I agree. And what I love about it is that even though it's so eclectic, in terms of external music, we have jazz, techno, old school rock, new school rock, hip hop, pop, dark techno, light techno. It still kind of feels like it's coming from the same place. So maybe it's just me and losing the perspective because I've been working on this project for so many years, but I really think it's its own thing.
Well, so how about specifically then, like with all the how much licensed music is there, first off?
130 plus tracks.
Yeah,
something like that.
Several more hours then, in other words.
Around 10 hours of content, yeah.
Holy of just licensed.
Well, it's not licensed per se. So, we wanted to avoid, well, the thing with licensing stuff is that you either get a license which is limited by time, and then you end up with GTA case where, a years after release, there's new patch coming, and lots of music gets cut out because license have ended, right?
Yeah.
So we didn't want to have that.
A controversial example of that.
Yeah, and obviously, you can do brute force approach and obtain a lifetime license, but that can cost you a fortune. So our way to get around that was to have artists contribute original music just for us. So whenever we were approaching Run the Jewels or Nina Kravis or whoever else, the Converge or other people, we were asking them to do something specifically for us.
Got it. So
And that's
it's actually
the secret, basically.
not really much in terms of licensed music in there.
Well, we still tend to call it licensed because it shortens the communication, but in reality, it's not really licensed; it's commissioned.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, the distinction is, I mean, yeah, you outlined the difference very well. And then tell me then about the actual band in the world itself.
Yeah, Refused. So Refused is samurai, basically. So we got Swedish hardcore punk. I think it's hardcore punk. I'm not very good with labels, by the way. So
I made them as a punk band. We can upgrade them to hardcore if you like.
So punk, post-punk, hardcore punk, whatever. Refused. And that should basically mean everything, because the shape of punk to come, their record from it was 2001, 1999, I don't remember, but that was a life-changing album for many people. And that secured them the place among in the Hall of Fame, among others. So basically there is this character called Johnny Silverhand in the lore of Cyberpunk 2020, who is a cult figure, a rocker boy, who was a band leader of of Samurai band. And the story goes that he had military past, and because he hated corporations so much, he died during the assault on one of them back then in the past, in the history of Night City. And since we knew about Keanu Reeves being involved and acting as Johnny Silverhand for quite some time, and we knew what kind of key character Johnny would be for the storyline, that obviously meant that this musical element would be very present and prominent. So it was when they meaning other directors at the company, they asked me how to tackle this. I told them that it wouldn't fly with doing just one track, because we are working on 100 hours long game, and imagine yourself placing Johnny in the game's world as a cult legend, as a cult figure, and having just one track by him. That wouldn't do the trick, because that wouldn't feel believable. So at least we need to do a few tracks, and the best case scenario, let's record the whole EP with them. So we got in touch with them. It was actually PT Adamczyk, the other composer at CDPR, who thought about them, because he has been a long time fan of their music. So this whole samurai project is his baby. He conceived it, he was overseeing it, and he made sure they delivered basically a six tracks EP just for us of completely new stuff. So the challenge was to write songs that would have a good connection with the game's lore. So Mike Pondsmith in the rule book of 2020 mentioned that we have Never Fade Away, that we have Black Dog, Chipping In, and a few others. He even wrote a few lines of lyrics for every single one of them, but that was basically it. That was only a stub. So we had to work on that, expand on that, rewrite the lyrics, come up with the music, and somehow find a way to place the music in game in a way that it feels like it's a part of a DNA of the whole thing. And what I love about having a musician playing key role in the storyline. Did you see Spinal Tap movie?
Yeah, sure.
I'm sure you did.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, it's one of the movies you need to watch as a musician, right?
Exactly.
So, yeah, what I love about Spinal Tap is that even though it's a comedy mockumentary, it kind of describes a life of a band on the tour really well. All these tensions between leading and backing guitarists, all this story around bringing someone's girlfriend on the stage, and letting her be part of the group, and how then this group can fall apart because of her, all that stuff. And even though I have not that a big of experience as a band member, even though I played in college and high school, I did experience these things firsthand with my bands.
Yeah.
Because there was always a girlfriend, there was always a matter of ambition between backing and leading guitarist, for example. So there was always this tension in the air, and Spinal Tap did described it very, very well for me. So what I love about having a musician as a key character in Cyberpunk is that we were able to at least make some nods to these stories. So, for example, we have a story of a backing guitarist from Samurai who is still alive, because the Johnny was a cult figure, was a superstar like 60 years ago, and someone still stole his song, and he contacts us because we are a mercenary, and goes like, "Those fuckers stole my song. Deal with that. Make them pay, or I don't know, make them vanish, or whatever. They stole my song." And the quest unfolds, and because it's a open world branching, narrative, it depends on your decisions whether, for example, you're gonna kill those thieves, musical thieves, or maybe, for example, work your way out to make this old rocker boy and these new guys talk to each other, and, for example, make a collaboration and create a song altogether, for example. So that was a really fun part for us, because obviously we had to cover that with music as well. So we had to come up with this collab song. We had to come up with the old rendition of Rock's song that has been stolen, and the new rendition of the song that has been plagiarized. So yeah, that was a lot of fun for us, actually.
Hilarious. That's fantastic. I love those kinds of things. Well, we're literally at 2 hours, and I feel like there's still so much that I would love to unpack. But
yeah,
I'm happy to wind it down. But I would love. It's worth mentioning that in the midst of your staff position work, you have managed to score some games outside of CDPR over the years, which is itself not that common. But in particular, one that you pointed me towards that I was really quite, you seemed very proud of it. And as soon as I dug into it, I realized why, which was this game 7, where the spirit of experimentation in your score was so vibrant and so exciting. We don't need to basically reboot and start this conversation from scratch again. But I'm curious if you wanted to say anything about that project, but also just the nature of how to juggle a staff position with what is basically a freelance composer gig on the side.
Well, truth is that being a freelance guy for me is like taking another drug and being addicted to it. I've been freelancing my whole life, and even though I'm lucky enough to have a staff position and have a monthly salary and all benefits that comes with it, it still sits within you that my father was a freelancer for all his musical life. So I was raised in that fashion, and frankly, this is the only world I know. So even though I've been trying out new things, meaning having a permanent position for almost 10 years, which sounds ridiculous that it's still something I would try out, but deep inside, the fun part about being freelancer is that it's like visiting for every single time a new restaurant. With new projects, you have new challenges, new sounds to discover, new project to do, and that's what I like the most of being a freelance guy. Even though obviously, I've been lucky enough to work on big projects as well. And with the 7, actually, when the world stop when the world stops being crazy with 2020, and once we wait enough to have GDC back open and other conferences, I was actually planning to do a talk about the 7 in particular, which would be the example of how can you do something original, something that is very yours with a minimal budget, because the whole recording budget for 7 was $1,000. That was it.
Yeah.
And within that $1,000, I was able to create so many colors of live performances that I wasn't even sure that was possible, but it turned out it was. So the premise is this: we have a post-apocalyptic world. The nuclear holocaust happened, like 500 years ago or so. So that means the civilization has rebuilt, but effectively it kind of stopped around Middle Ages. And obviously there are some archaeologists that dig the ground and find artifacts of old civilizations, so nanobots, other stuff. And since they so regressed technologically, they read those artifacts as magical items, not as a really high-tech stuff, but magic items, artifacts. So when we tried to come up with an idea how to tell the story of this world with the music, we came into conclusion that the best way would be to bite into that digging in the ground thing. So people build their homes from whatever they could find. So, a piece of metal, some bricks, some stone, whatever, there you go, right? So something like that. And when they would like to entertain themselves, musical instruments didn't exist because of the apocalypse. So they would probably try to make musical instruments out of items they have at their disposal. So probably a piece of metal string, maybe a bucket, something like that, and you patch one thing to another and you have some sort of a guitar. So I was trying to find out someone who is basically making instruments from scrap, and I did find a guy in Wrocław, Poland. The guy who is a musical inventor or musical instruments collector, because he also owns a vast collection of toy pianos and old violins. He also let me play on 100-year-old Stroh fiddle, so that was also a good find. And basically I somehow convinced him to let me in to his workshop for 3 days and spend time with me for 3 days. And that was the $1,000 I've spent. Basically that was his that was the money he would get from it. So he would have to hang out with me for 3 days, 10 hours straight. I would just record with him everything I could put my hands on. And then I would spend weeks on, editing, cleaning up and chopping those recordings and basically making a library of unusual instruments. So we had a 100-year-old Stroh violin. We had a double bass made of a paper tube and office chair. For example, we had a cello made out of bucket and some metal elements. We had various renditions of zithers he also made by himself, all from scrap. So, these instruments were very hard to tune, very hard to play on, didn't sound nice, but that was the sound we were looking for.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's the whole secret, actually.
It's awesome. I mean, and I saw some of the photos of these things. I just like to point out that when we've hung out, I did not demand that you pay me. And so I didn't even know it was on the table that was an option. So that's been an informative revelation from this conversation.
Yeah, but going back to this whole $1,000 thing, I oftentimes hear other composers or those aspiring ones that you are lucky because you work at CDPR, you got tons of money and you can afford everything. So, do not tell me how to run my indie project and do not tell me I can do better. And for me, that was a clear example that with a bit of creativity, bit of being clever and lots of research, you can actually create something that has never been done before. Because, that the sound of the instruments that guy created are like nothing else. You would have to visit him, record him to basically reproduce what I did, right? So with a bit of I'm again missing the word. Let's see. With a bit of effort, exactly. With a bit of effort and time, it turns out you do not have to spend a fortune on live recordings. You just need to be clever about it.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think that's a spectacular note to take this home with for the younger composers who may be listening. But I honestly think that there's probably comparisons that could be drawn to all areas of game development where you look at the resources employed by a CDPR or a Sony or an Activision or whomever and think, oh, well, I can't really, unless I can do that, I can't do anything. And it ignores the vast spectrum of possibilities in between. And God knows, in my case, at least, I think some of my best work has always been when I don't have this bottomless well to draw from, and you have to figure out something else.
Yeah, you have to be creative. There's no excuse here. Yeah,
it's addicting. I love that, in a way, Cyberpunk is the perfect demonstration that you can have the budget to basically do everything, and yet that doesn't mean that the score needs to be quote unquote expensive looking from the standpoint of big orchestras and weeks and weeks at Abbey Road and all those kinds of things that look very glamorous for it to be the best possible score. Of course, me assuming it's the best possible score. Once I play the game, I'll let you know what I really think.
Well, the main takeaway is that, the main takeaway is that in the end, you can have all the money in the world, but in the end, what's really matters is the idea. And that's what's actually, all of us should be searching for. This grand idea you can bite into and, take the most out of it. That's how I see things, at least.
I'm not going to top that. Let's end it there. Marcin, my friend, thank you for giving me 2 hours late into the night in Warsaw. And I honestly can't wait to ruin my life by playing this game.
I hope you do. Thanks a lot.
Thank you for joining us for the Game Maker's Notebook. For more information on the Academy of Interactive Arts and Sciences, our podcasts, and our other initiatives, please visit www.interactive.org.